grid security. We're in for a very important discussion and a very significant discussion. But before jumping into introducing our speaker, I wanted to acknowledge that these are difficult times. And as Auburn University President Dr. Jay Gouge aptly put it, our nation is hurting from the devastation caused by COVID-19 to recent racial injustice. And now is the time for healing, reflection, and action. All that said and done, as significant as those events are, and they really are, protecting the grid is also a primary consideration for our nation and for our national security. And dare I say that some of our adversaries recognize that this is not only a significant vulnerability, but could also be planning in terms of hostile activities during this period in time. But without further ado, I wanted to introduce our special guest today, Sean Plankey. Sean is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Preparedness at the Department of Energy, better known as CESER. Sean comes to the job with a wealth of expertise and an amazing background. He served in the National Security Council. He also understands the private sector, having served at BP, working on cybersecurity issues, and is a graduate of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. Spent 13 years as an officer in the Coast Guard, including a tour in Afghanistan when he was working in support of U.S. Cyber Command. So couldn't ask for a better person than Sean Plankey to discuss our issues today. Sean, it's a real privilege to have you with us, and I thought maybe you can frame some of the discussions. I mean, your office has been in the center of the storm. You've been a very busy few months for you, so I thought maybe you can start framing some of the issues, and then we'll get into a conversation. So, Sean, thank you so much, and welcome to the Plains virtually.
Yes, thank you for having me. As much as I've said to you, I want to go stand next to the Bo Jackson statue down at Auburn. We had to do this. Virtually from the house. So thank you for having me. Good afternoon. Appreciate being here. As you said, I'm at the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. That office, we share the commitment. We are the doers, the Office of Doers. We share in finding practical solutions to infrastructure security, which is also fundamental to the McCrary Institute mission. Not sure how many Auburn alums we have here, but your institute was founded on a donation from the Alabama Power Foundation. Putting grid security and energy security right at the heart of at the DNA of this institute. So really happy to be here today. Really happy to talk to everybody and you. So at COE, at CESER, we've long been responsible for emergency support function 12, which is energy. That's the DHS designated emergency support function in the National Response Framework that basically says that we are the responders at the department. My office in particular, we send out responders whenever we have a grid issue, such as a hurricane, a tornado, any sort of reason that causes the grid to go down. We're sending out our people to help the private industry bring the grid back online. And then our office in particular, we're also the lead for Presidential Policy Directive 21. That PPD 21 was signed in 2013, and it tasks our office to own the federal government's responsibility to secure energy infrastructure from all hazards: natural, man-made, physical security, energy, cybersecurity. Our office is that interface to the private sector to provide that security level. we're going into our third year of the CESER office existence. We were established under then Secretary Perry, and we're really hitting the ground running this year, working on training for industrial control systems, cybersecurity professionals. We're working on integration with DHS and DoD and cyber incident response and cyber prevention of incidents. And then also we have a strong research and development portfolio, leading Department of Energy cybersecurity investments for research. This R&D program in particular invests in about $70 million annually in research through the national labs, through universities in the United States, together to find solutions to advance the cybersecurity issue. I mean, we're looking for everything from game-changing commercial products that could better protect 80% of the critical infrastructure in the United States, which is privately owned, all the way through to means of communication, right? So if you had, or black start technology, which means if you've lost everything, how do we regenerate and restart the grid, and protect and continue to allow the continuity of operations of government in the United States to keep moving forward. So in particular, I know everybody's been affected by COVID-19. I wanted to highlight some of the things that we've done over the past 3-4 months now to respond to COVID-19. We've, in particular, our office, we stood up our incident command structure, where we've worked with the energy sector through the Sector Coordinating Council. And that's 2 different sector coordinating councils. Energy is more than just electricity. It includes oil and gas as well. And so we've worked with the oil and gas community as well as the electricity community to maintain constant contact with them, understand what PPE do they need, are they going into sequestration. When we think about that, many of the electricity companies around the United States determined that they were in a high-risk area, and their power control engineers, the engineers that work in the control centers that decide how energy is balanced across the electric grid of the United States. They said, hey, this is too high risk. If our people are infected, we're going to have a major issue. And so they said, hey, we're going to go on sequestration. In particular, one that was in the news for doing this was NYPA, the New York Power Authority. And they went into sequestration. So we got with them and said, hey, how do we make sure you have what you need? How can we help you ensure that you have the personal protective equipment that you need, gloves, hand sanitizer, masks, those types of things, all the way down to even working with the determined if testing was needed. And so what we did there, we got with FEMA and Health and Human Services and determined how we could work with them to get testing, if needed, to keep the grid online, right? Keep our people working the grid, working those front lines, safe and not infected or infecting others, with COVID-19. So that's where that's been our focus the past 3 months. But I also want to talk about some of the things that we're going to do and we're leading into now in 2020. So one of our key initiatives, you may have heard of it, it's called the Pathfinder Initiative. The Pathfinder Initiative is a tri-agency agreement. It's between us, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Homeland Security. And this basically is a whole of government approach to try to better protect the energy sector. Basically, our thought process here is our SSA role is to prevent incidents from occurring. DHS's role is incident response. That they're the lead responder for the United States government to protect critical infrastructure across the U.S. And then you have DoD, which, as everyone knows, is our offensive element to go get our adversary and deliver effects back. And as you've seen, the National Cyber Strategy, the first cyber strategy in 10 years, it was issued by this administration. And the cyber strategy helped promote an idea that DoD then took forward to a concept of defending forward and persistently engaging our adversaries. No longer will we sit in a theory of Cold War where we build up armament on one side and they build up on the other, and we try to deter each other through an arms race. In cyber, it doesn't exactly work that way. The adversary is persistently engaging us, as you've heard from many of the cyber incidents that occur. The adversary is persistently engaging us, so we need to respond back, send them forward, and go get the adversary in gray space. Well, for DoD to do that, they have to understand what's going on in the United States. And so when we established the Pathfinder Initiative, we said, well, how can we use our industry relationship? We're the closest government entity to the private sector, which is 80% of the U.S. electrical grid, as we've said, critical infrastructure. And we said, how do we help DoD and DHS understand what's going on the grid so we can then help them transition to further the incident response and then transition that to go getting the adversary. And this thought process really came forward when we sat back and we said, we've had different incidents. DHS would go out. The first thing that we would get is a phone call from the private sector that said, hey, we were, the government, you're so big, who do we work with? Who's the authoritative voice? Who's responsible for what? So we noticed that issue. And DOE doesn't do incident response. So, obviously we didn't have the capacity, and we're not supposed to have the capacity that DHS has. But we need to broker that relationship because we are on the prevention side consistently talking to the private sector. And then we said, DoD largely focused externally. How do we bring them into the fight so they understand domestically what's going on, and we can transition them in a timely manner to go defend forward and go get the adversaries attacking us, the advanced persistent threats that are engaging the United States. So we started that initiative in January of this year. We're working through right now to build these prevention and incident response playbooks with industry. And we're looking forward to then taking that into actual exercises where we work with private sector companies, run through our playbook all the way through to DHS incident response and the handoff, the simultaneous handoff to DoD, where they actually exercise their capacity to demonstrate an attack on a simulated grid environment. Right? It will be an actual physical grid environment, but it won't obviously be in a live part of the U.S. grid or another nation's grid. It'll be a lab environment, so we can actually demonstrate that handoff from prevention to response to defend forward, in a manner that shows what really can happen and how the whole of government response works. So I was looking forward to talking about that, and looking forward to talking about some of our other research and development capabilities that we're doing this year. and I wanted to pass it back to you. Thank you for this interest in discussing energy security.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you for a great opening salvo of some of the vast mission and the criticality of the mission you and your office play to protect our nation's critical infrastructure, and I would argue the most critical of our critical infrastructure at the very pinnacle of the list. And I also appreciated your discussion around the Pathfinder Initiative, which I do want to pull the thread on in a little bit because, as you may know, I had the privilege to serve on the Cyber Solarium Commission, and we not only supported the Pathfinder initiatives, but had a number of potential follow-ons to be able to build on some of that great work. But I wanted to start with sort of a scene setting. I mean, when you look at CESER and when you look at the overall threats and risk that pertain to the sector, how do you rack and stack that? I mean, how do you envision that day in, day out? And what's your ultimate strategy? Because at the end of the day, none of us are in the business of risk elimination. It is risk management and managing some of those issues. So talk us through just how you feel the threat environment is, and then how you manage some of that risk.
That's absolutely happy to. So when we talk about risk, we use the common framework of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. And what I've found in my years of work in the intelligence community and then also on the cybersecurity side of the house is everyone focuses on that vulnerability. I mean, if you remember, we've had years and years of discussions about 0 days and what do we do and how can you predict that. And I always went back to it and I thought of two things. The first one was, well, who's the threat actor? And what's their intent for doing something? And then what's their capability to do something? I always use as an example ISIS, right? If you remember 2013, 2014, ISIS was making huge statements like they wanted to attack critical infrastructure, hit at the heart of America, etc. A lot of intent. But when you actually examined what their cyber capability was, it wasn't really significant, right? So a lot of intent, not much capability. So I think one of the roles of CESER and where I'm leading us to go is how do we really characterize that? Cyber should not be an afterthought. Private sector CEOs should never be saying anytime, any place, because it's not realistic. Cyber actors should know that, CEOs should know that cyber actors, especially at the nation state level, hit at a time and a place of their choosing. And if we can characterize that, then you can start to understand where and why you might be a target. So then the other piece of that is the consequence side. And when we think about the consequence, you have to understand why something occurs. When we look at the adversaries, they do things for a reason, right? So like Russia in particular has a strong focus in the oil and gas sector. Why? Because their government relies on oil and gas to fund their government, to fund their defense budget, to fund their social programs, right? So they care a lot about what the global energy market is doing. Other entities are in different play. If you look at Made in China 2025, it says we want to be an energy independent country. And to do that, we need to look at extraction capabilities. We need to look at refinery technology. And we need to look at autonomy, right? How do we do, autonomous industrial engineering? So if they're thinking about those things, then you can start to walk the dog on saying, hey, how does that impact me? How does it impact my business? And the job of the government is to defend you from nation adversaries. So if we can provide characterization of what those threat actors look like, then we're taking a big chunk of that risk equation and giving the private sector something they can work with to better defend their network, which in turn allows them to provide better energy to the United States.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. So to sum up, not all hacks are the same. Hackers are different. Intentions are different. Capabilities. But clearly, top of CESER's concern are nation-state actors, those with both the intent and capability. And I would imagine post-Soleimani, there was a lot of activity in your office to work with the private sector, which is what I wanted to discuss next. And that is what's working, what still needs to be done in terms of syncing up that public-private partnership we all talk about. Sometimes we're long on nouns, not always as long on the verbs as I think all of us would like to be. But I'd be curious how you see that going, if you can discuss maybe the EISAC and what some of the other initiatives are. And I'm really glad you brought up Alabama Power Foundation. There are a number of Southern Company executives on today's webinar, and we at Auburn and McCrary Institute in particular have a very good, strong, robust relationship with Southern Company. But we also have Dominion Power, we also have Duke, and many others on today's webinar. So I'd sort of be curious how you see that going right now, and where can it go to even up the game a little more in the future?
Okay, so I think that there's a few key areas where we can move forward. I'll talk about the ISAC area. We'll talk about supply chain, and then the third one is going to be I don't know if personnel maybe is the right way to describe it. So when I think about the ISAC and I think about what's next, I like to think about what's the future of ISAC. And where are they going? One of the things that I think about is when I worked with the ISAC from the private sector, they were very focused on indicators of compromise, right? I'm sure you're aware. CISA has AIS, the automated indicator sharing. Basically, these are hashes or signatures of or IP addresses of known adversaries. The problem is in cybersecurity, that's your known, right? If I'm running a SOC and I see one of my my firewall or my endpoint security protection pops a known bad indicator, right? An indicator of compromise, then that means I'm already hit, right? That means that means that something has already occurred. And at that point, you're in incident response mode, because known, if you see a known bad thing on your system, you've already been compromised, or somebody already clicked on a link, somebody's already done something, and the fire has already started. And so when I think about that, ISACs have been prolific at sharing those indicators of compromise. Well, the other problem with that is adversaries. A lot of the security industry has built on IOCs, on using IOCs in different methods. And a lot of the adversaries have pivoted and said, I understand how that works, so we're going to modify our attack vector. So now you see adversaries doing things like, as you've heard before, live off the land, or where they use internal controls of the operating systems to cause an effect. You also see adversaries saying, hey, I'm going to use the cloud environments throughout the United States, right? I'm going to use Azure. I'm going to use AWS. And my average time now, if you look at what the average time is for an adversary in a cloud environment, it's less than 16 minutes. Well, the FBI takes generally 4 days or longer to get a search warrant. So if you're an adversary and you're on a cloud environment for 16 minutes and you're delivering an effect, you're gone days before, the way the policy works is, the way law enforcement is currently configured to get a search warrant to even figure out what happened. And these type of effects are even more pertinent to the industrial control system environment. right? Adversaries in ICS are not using, they're not using malware. If you're seeing, standard like Windows malware on your environment in ICS, you obviously have a bigger problem already, right? That's not what nation state attackers are using in industrial control system environments, because it's not native to the environment, and it's an obvious issue. So we're sitting there, and that's the first part of the ISAC. Is I think ISACs are going to move past the known known, and if we can better characterize that threat space, they're going to move to the known unknown, and they're going to say, I know that these are the APTs, the Rosetta Stone of APTs, and then they're going to say these are characterized, and you're starting to eliminate the unknowns and saying and knowing who those attackers are, and then you can work better based on intent and consequence. So that's the first part. The second part where we can move forward is that supply chain issue. The training we provide with Idaho National Labs called Cyber-Enabled Consequence-Driven Engineering, CCE for short, with the government, so we love acronyms. So CCE basically says, how do we target our own system, right? So we bring in the private sector and we say, if you were an adversary, a nation state adversary, how would you target your own network, right? And so when we think about that, one of the guys that leads it is a former intelligence community member. And he did a bunch of analysis saying, when I was in the intel community and I needed to gain access to something, how did I do that? And he found that for the meager cost of roughly $12,000, he could find a way to gain access to any system, right? You could have all sorts of cyber-enabled measures, and you pay a guy off for the cost of the small pickup truck, used pickup truck,
yep.
And you're getting somebody to give you access. So if you think about it from that perspective in the supply chain, it's not that unrealistic that all of the third party entities that service the industrial control system community would either inadvertently or on purpose provide access to somebody else. Maybe they don't even know that that's an agent of another government, and they're just thinking, oh, well, that's another guy, he's a part of the warranty package, and they have to upgrade the firmware or whatever it may be, right? Like, how do we do a better job of securing that supply chain? And in particular, the program that we're running there is called Citrix. And Citrix is looking at ways to establish a whole of community firmware repository or validation mechanism where you can validate everything from fluke meters and multimeters and the firmware that they have all the way through to giant transformers in the firmware that come on single phasers and transformers across the U.S. And so that's the second piece of where I think we can go in the future there.
No, that's awesome.
My third piece, I'm actually blanking on what I had said it was. Give me a minute and it'll come back to me.
No, that was excellent. That was a lot there. And I love the Idaho National Lab approach to be able to look through the eyes of the adversary. And I think you touched on something that's very unique. When people think supply chain, they're rightfully thinking hardware, firmware, software, if you look at it through a cyber architecture perspective. But there's also the middleware. There's the person. And ultimately, insider threats are going to be at the top of anyone's list, whether they just have an axe to grind, disgruntled, or an agent of a foreign service. So I'm glad you brought that up in the supply chain discussion, because it is also about the workforce, which can be the greatest good, but there can also be some vulnerabilities that can be exploited and addressed. So thank you for that. I want to touch on one other thought, though, before I pull off this question. And I mean, if you think about it strategically, even the biggest companies in the world didn't go into business thinking they had to defend themselves against foreign militaries and foreign intelligence services. But to one extent or another, that's precisely what's happening right now. And the Southern companies and the Duke Energies and the Dominions and the Con Eds, they've got the resources and they've been investing heavily in trying to up their game and be a good partner. Because when you talk partnerships, when you talk intelligence or even law enforcement, it all hinges around trust, confidence, and ultimately someone has to give and receive. So if one is just giving and not receiving, and or vice versa, it doesn't lead to a good partnership. How do we pull in the co-ops? How do we pull in the smaller companies? How do we pull in the gas companies that you mentioned? Because when you look at the supply chain for the grid, it's also water. You need water up and running in the event of a major incident. So they're interdependent upon other critical infrastructures as well. How do you see that playing out? So the smaller companies that may not have the resources, but they are a single potential point failure, and then some of the other critical infrastructure sectors. And I don't mean to go too long on that, but I'd be curious what some of your thoughts are, because I think the EISAC, it's done some phenomenal work, and EEI and other entities working with DOE and other agencies have done some phenomenal work. So, but I'm concerned about some of the smaller entities that don't have the resources they can devote.
Now, there's a great point there, and there's two different things we can hit on. Little known to many in America is that the 4,000 municipality and small electric carriers, right, last mile carriers, distribution providers in the United States. A lot of them, like you said, well, none of them are big business, right? And a lot of them, like you said, are run by taxpayers in a municipality type environment. And many of those, in fact, also own the water. So like in San Francisco, the municipality is the water provider and the electrical provider. That's the same in LA as well, right? They use the same equipment, right? It's the same manufacturers providing in the water environment that are providing in the electrical environment. Exactly. So if you think about a security threat, it spans both players. In a lot of cases, you have the same, industrial control system professionals working in both environments, right? So how do we provide them some measure of enhanced security? So in particular, this year, we've been congressionally designated to spend $6 million in particular to go directly to support rural and municipal carriers and co-ops throughout America. I've been in talks with our partners at EPA. EPA is the SSA for water. So we've been in talks with EPA to saying, hey, let us show you what we're doing at the national lab. Can we show you our R&D and our supply chain work, and then bring in your water component there, so we can maximize taxpayer dollars, one, but two, also provide security on the water side as well as the electrical side, right? Because if we leave the door open on one side or the other, you're still facing the threat. And let's be conscious that they can't, these security solutions can't be extremely labor intensive, right? Cybersecurity is not a profit generator in an electricity energy provider company. No, it's a cost, right? And a lot of times when you think about the municipalities, and no disrespect intended, they're just smaller entities. A lot of times the IT guy is also the security guy, is also the guy who's, might be mowing the front lawn on Friday, right? And that's just the way it is, right? There, on one hand, you have somebody who has a total love and ownership of what he's working on or she's working on. But on the other hand, you're forced to be a jack of all trades. So we're saying, how do we put out programs that can support that? So that's where it gets into our education side of the house. And we have our cyber strike training, which we run with Idaho National Labs, and we bring that around the country. Obviously, COVID has put a little bit of glue in the gears, slowing us down. But basically, that engagement, we bring it around the country, and we reenact some of the attacks that we've seen from other nations on actual equipment that we bring on site, and we run a couple-day training with them to say, hey, this is how you notice what this could look like. This is how you can defend against it. And the interesting thing of what we've pivoted is we've started to pivot to say, we don't just want the municipality. We want the first responder. We want the chief of the fire department. We want if it's, like a refinery in a port environment, we want the Coast Guard on team. We want the FBI there with them. So not only are we getting the training to them, but we're also getting them to understand each other, and they could see, oh, I know, Billy understands that, Sue's good at this, Johnny's great there, Becky's good at that, right? Like how do we, cross-pollinate so we can understand everyone understands what the other people are thinking about. So when it does hit an emergency response, they have a vector they can work with there.
Awesome. Great stuff. And I might note during the Cold War, the Air Force had a great program called Checkmate, which is very similar. Yeah. And then you build out an understanding the adversary's technology, but also how other actors, not just those fighting the MiGs in combat, in aerial combat, but everyone else was dependent on that. So very, very cool. I'm going to have to jump to one more question because I know we're going to pull in another Deputy Assistant Secretary at DOE, Chuck Kosak, in a little bit to discuss some of the executive order, which I think is important. But I'm going to have to punt on the Pathfinder question that I really wanted to ask you. But I want to ask another more fundamental question, and that is IT-OT convergence. So normally when people think cybersecurity, they think it's an IT challenge. I think increasingly we're seeing a convergence from the adversary's perspective. Again, not looking at it through mirror imaging the way we look at it, but looking at it through the eyes of the adversary. Physical cyber convergence is the future in some of these issues. And when you're talking about industrial control systems in particular, it's an OT. This is a cyber effect can have a kinetic impact. And I'd be very curious what you're doing and thinking about there, because I think this is not fully appreciated, but really critical going forward. So any thoughts you can share on that?
Yes, and that was actually my third point on that I couldn't remember.
Aha, good. See?
I've found working, across industry from the government and from the private sector side, a lot of time the cybersecurity professional is an IT person, right? It's somebody who, was the IT guru for the longest time, was probably a tinkerer, in their garage, like building different systems, networks on their own, whatever. When cybersecurity challenge came for the industrial control system side, they're entrepreneurial. They want to learn new things. They take it on, right? So when you have a discussion, you say, hey, we have a cybersecurity issue. They get the IT guy. The problem is the industrial control system environment is different. It runs off different protocols, Modbus, DMP3, different. It's doing different things for different purposes. And so oftentimes we see in that community, the operations manager or the head of country or the plant manager is making the decisions on what industrial control systems to put in those environments. And the cybersecurity professional is not necessarily a part of the equation because that guy's focused on the IT system that's in that environment. And now you see there's a lot of products where the IT system is being utilized for business efficiencies, for security, and is being placed over the top of or connected to the industrial control system environment. So that OT-IT convergence is going to continue to move forward, whether it be intentionally or unintentionally, because many times in some of these distributed, high-tech plant environments, people might realize they've connected the IT and the OT environment. But it's going to be a necessity to understand that interplay, to understand where your protocol handoffs are, to understand why you might want to connect your IT environment, because you have your CFO and your business players on one side thinking I can do this faster and cheaper if I connect my IT system so I can draw efficiencies from my industrial control system environment. But then you have your security aspect, which is slower and make things harder, right? So those don't always agree. And so what we're working on is saying, and I've been talking to some of the CISOs at some of these major, energy corporations that you've talked about, is saying, how do we ensure we're having this cyber discussion? We bring the plant manager to the equation. We bring the COO to that discussion. One of the things that I found really successful to do that is actually walking through exercise. So when the COO understands that this isn't a cyber hygiene issue, this is a safety issue, because this cyber effect can have a physical consequence, and we demonstrate that through real-life incidents such as the Triton Trisis attack, such as the Ukrainian attack, and other attacks that have occurred. We can then demonstrate to the COO that that's a safety issue, and how do you respond to it, and how do we make sure we bring the right people to that discussion. So that's one of the things.
Awesome. No, thank you, Sean. That's an excellent set of points, and also relevant in so many other factors, bringing in the broader C-suite to understand that cyber is a risk that cuts across a company, I think is integral. And I might say it's taken time for the government to recognize that, but I think it now has. So awesome set of points there. Let me, before we jump into the executive order, I wanted to let people know if they have questions to ask them in the comment section, and they will be texted to me to be able to fly. Hopefully we'll have time for one or two, but I wanted to turn quickly to the recent executive order that was promulgated on bulk power, which touches on a number of points that you raised, Sean, including supply chain and the like. So I thought maybe allow you to sort of touch on it quickly, and then I understand we have another colleague of yours who I've had the privilege to work on mission assurance related issues when he was at DoD. Very thoughtful individual, but I thought, Sean, you could introduce Chuck, and also if you want to jump into the question first. So tell me tell me about the executive order. What's its significance? What are the implications, and how do you see this playing out?
Right. So the executive order was a long needed, great piece, great direction from the president saying, hey, we're concerned that, the manufacturing base in America has disappeared for scale, electrical components, and even small components, right? And to look at that and how we can provide security to those devices, right? From our perspective on CESER, our role is vector specification. We doing our best to go back to characterize that threat, to let the department know, what are contested devices, what are elements and facilities that could be at risk to being compromised, that may need priority assistance, to respond to, and then what are the R&D technologies that could answer clauses in there that talk about, hey, I just made a $1 million investment on a piece of electrical grid, and now you're telling me that there's a potential for compromise. How do I provide a level of security on it? So we're looking at our R&D components and saying, hey, what D might we have that provides a monitoring capability, that sort of avenue, and have some and empower the private sector to monitor and protect devices. And so as these, while we're the industry face there and have an R&D investment, Chuck Kozak, who's on the Deputy Assistant Secretary, Kozak is the lead for the department. He's under the Office of Electricity. And so CESER, how do we, fit in the framework that Deputy Assistant Secretary Kozak has designed? How do we support the department and the Navy security? Chuck, have a moment to talk about, his needs for the EO and in helping our nation. So, Chuck.
Awesome.
Okay, great, Frank. It's great to hear your voice, and Sean, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure and an honor to participate with the Institute on sort of these critical issues. Just to start, I'd just like to say that Sean did an excellent job sort of laying out the fact that our near-peer adversaries, Russia, China in particular, there was a little bit of a reference to Soleimani, Iran, obviously, and North Korea. But particularly our near-peer adversaries continue to advance their cyber capabilities to degrade critical electricity, communications, transportation, other sectors essential to our national defense. So whether you're talking about the Gerasimov Doctrine as it relates to Russia or China, what they refer to as systems destruction warfare, the bottom line is they are aggressively focused on bringing the fight to the homeland and bringing their capabilities and intentions, and through increased technological advances and campaign planning have better intended effects. And at the end of the day, what it comes down to is to try to strip our very powerful and talented warfighters of their lethality here at home. So if we can delay their progression from garrison and movements east or west and projection from the homeland to theaters of operation, perhaps they can create strategic advantages. Perhaps they can set the stage for coercing U.S. leadership or having other effects on U.S. decision-making and the critical role it plays in the world. And you alluded to this, Frank, a little bit about how skeptics might think, a typical malware attack on the bulk power system would require customized plans for each utility, given the differences between utility OT systems and topographies. And we believe that sophistication is there. And we believe that the mapping, particularly of our near peers, is extremely aggressive and continues to be more so going forward, even more so than during the Cold War, given sort of the center of gravity here in the homeland. And so we need to put the puck where it belongs, not dish it off to the left or the right and try to build a play. We need to be very strategic going forward. And so what I would focus on is there are 4 pillars in the bulk power system executive order. And for many of you who are participating in this, you would know that the bulk power system, in effect, is like the spinal cord, like the human spinal cord. It is the critical backbone of the nation's electric power grid. And so, any introduction of compromise there becomes a cascading problem. And as everyone knows, electricity is really fundamental to transportation, to communications, to these critical, the critical musculature by which the modern America not only defends itself, but executes day-to-day essential functions. The first pillar of the EO prohibits any acquisition, importation, transfer, or installation of bulk power system electric equipment which has a nexus to any foreign adversary it poses an undue risk to national security or the economy. So, as you can imagine, on one end of the spectrum, you have least cost, high risk as it pertains to this growing threat in the United States. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have potentially higher cost but lower risk. And so the nature of this business is prohibiting manufacturing and supply chain processes that allow ample opportunity for near-peer adversaries to either affect the manufacturing process or influence the supply chain process in such a way that the introduction of compromise to the bulk power system is not only within their capabilities and intentions, but that there are probabilistic attack vectors where they bring those capabilities and intentions into play, and we unwittingly allow that to happen. So we need to take a good look at not allowing this to happen. And so those prohibitions will be going forward within 150 days of the president's signature, which is on or about at least the notice of public ruling on the 28th of September. The second pillar authorizes the Secretary to establish criteria for recognizing particular equipment and vendors as pre-qualified. I think this is where, working with our CESER colleagues, Alex Gates and Sean Plankey, using the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, or ESCC, as well as the Oil and Natural Gas Subsector Coordinating Council, to work very, very closely with industry. Lots of leadership out there, lots of tremendous expertise, and lots of very goodwill. As you've recently heard, Tom Fanning, testify, on the Hill, his first sentence was, "We are a nation at war." The distinction between war and peace is blurred. The DIE model, diplomacy, information, military, economic, our near peers are using these tools on a daily basis to diminish the U.S.'s position in the world. And so this second pillar is very focused on pre-qualifying entities and also establishing criteria to diminish foreign adversary influence in the manufacturing and supply chain process that where we know there's evidence-based risk and where the threat is worsening. And then the third pillar calls for identifying any now prohibited bulk power system equipment already in use, allowing the government to develop strategies and to work with asset owners to identify, isolate, monitor, and replace this equipment as appropriate. And so that's dealing with existing risk. Given the situation we find ourselves in, as Sean pointed out, this is a long overdue, effort to bring some reasonable and effective supply chain risk management to the fore here. We will be looking at identifying equipment, isolating it, monitoring it as appropriate, and where we find undue risk to the bulk power system, we will replace equipment as necessary. And then finally, because this is the last pillar, because this is not a static threat, but a threat that is serious now and continues to worsen over time with increasing campaign planning and increasing sophistication. We're establishing a task force which will compose the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, Energy at the helm, as well as the Director of National Intelligence and others to take a very thoughtful, a very surgical approach to what we're doing, and bear in mind that we would expect
Hey, Chuck, I think we lost you. Hopefully, I am still on. That was really insightful input. Really appreciate that. Thank you for that. If you can get back on, that would be great. But we're going to turn to questions because we're actually very close to the end of our time. And I'm going to start with the first question, which touches precisely on the executive order. Comes from James Gooseby, who is a Southern Company executive and also, dare I say, a senior fellow at the McCrary Institute. And he's asking about a number of trusted suppliers are outsourcing engineering tasks, such as electrical design, control system, logic configuration, and he's wondering how much of a risk this poses and what they should be thinking about to mitigate these measures. Sean, you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. You mean it doesn't say designed in Cupertino on that? No, I think that's a real risk. And the way that we get around that is if we think of profile and design frameworks of design, right? If we start looking at NIST has put together some designs of how do you look at security in your developmental process. If we can start incorporating that into engineering designs, and I realize these are sophisticated, physics, basically sophisticated physics and electrical engineering. That's if we can start incorporating those design reviews, security design reviews in the process, I think we can get past that. I do recognize that there's extensive components made in Eastern Europe, sometimes extensive design components done in China on the other side. How do we have security design reviews built into that process? I think that's a great question, and it's something that if we start looking at profiles and how can we take design engineering profiles and add in security? I think that is a good avenue for us to investigate.
Awesome. And I think just generally speaking, building out the manufacturing base when it comes to the most critical of our critical infrastructures in the U.S. is important. So great question, great response. I'm going to touch on two more, and we're over our time. So if we can be a little quick on these. The first is from Gabriel Henderson, who's asking about what role does proprietary knowledge in private industries have in restricting government efforts to manage risk to the grid, if any. And then I'm going to ask another question. This comes from Ronald Marks, a former intelligence community officer and also part of our family in terms of the McCrary Institute, who's asking about DOD is rolling out CMMC. Does DOE across the defense industrial base? Does is DOE thinking about doing something similar? So if you can answer both those and as crisply as we can, that would be great.
So the second question is going to be the first one. If you look at CMMC and you compare that to cybersecurity capability maturity modeling, which is C2M2, you'll find some very significant overlap. So C2M2 was a Department of Energy initiative that came out in 2009, was version 1. And version 2 actually is coming out this fall. And version 2 is our compliance methodology. And you'll see that it matches CMMC looks suspiciously alike C2M2.
Good.
Just put it that way. Hey, how do you make a good junior officer? Control C, Control V. And then to answer the proprietary piece, basically, if I understand that question right, that's the corporate knowledge, understanding of your own energy, environment. Let's say if you're a regional or a small municipality, there's obviously quirks in your environment that you may know about, things you may design into the overarching security of your environment. I think that's what he's getting at. I think those designs are essential. The one thing you have to remember, and this still goes back to the threat, the understanding the threat actor, is that a nation state is going to take 1,000 different ways to get at, bite of the apple,
Yep.
and
Yep.
they have all the time to do it. So whereas, a criminal has limited resources, limited time, a nation state has unlimited resources, unlimited time. I mean, if you think about it, to think about China in particular, 17 dynasties, where 15 of the 17 dynasties have been around longer than the United States. They classify the last 100 years as an unfortunate century, and they're classifying things in centuries when we're thinking about it in 6 months or 4-year voting window. I don't know that the proprietary aspect that you inherently might have of your own network is going to be a strong enough defense mechanism. And that's why, we as the government have to do a better job of defending our electric grid against those nation state adversaries, right? Protecting the sovereignty of America.
Sean, what an awesome way to close out. Thank you so much for spending some quality time with us. Incredibly insightful, extremely important work. And I might note that Auburn University, in addition to our policy and research work, we're about arming that next generation of cyber warriors and cyber defenders, and we want to make sure that we're equipping them and arming them with the right sets of tools and capabilities to help advance our national interests. Because I honestly feel our national and economic security are more inextricably intertwined today than they ever have been. So, Sean, thank you. Keep doing good things, and we will get you on campus soon, and you will not only see Bo Jackson, but you will see Charles Barkley as well. So, and the statues there. So, good stuff, War Eagle, and thank you.